Chicago. I have a lot of relatives who lived over in this area here, and I went to school in Chicago, and I worked in Chicago, and I'm a really big fan of Chicago in general. I grew up loving comic books. I always wanted to draw comics ever since I was really little. And about 10 years ago, a little over 10 years ago, I entered into the comic book industry, and I started out by doing a bunch of different books. Some you may have heard of, some you may not have. The first thing I did was a history of Marie Curie, who was somebody who who discovered radioactivity. I also did a book on King Kong, The Saint, which used to be an old radio show, and then it was a TV show, and then it was a movie, and it's been all kinds of different things. And one of the last things I did was 1,000 Ways to Die, which is based on a TV show on the Spike Network, and it's about people who die stupidly. And I had never seen it until I actually worked on the book, so that was kind of interesting. And I was looking to do something new, and I didn't quite know what I wanted to do. And I wanted to do something on my own. And I was bored at work one day. I work in advertising. I work for an advertising illustration studio downtown. And I started doing a Google search because I just didn't feel like doing the work that I had. And when I was doing that, I was typing in family members' names. And one of the names I typed in was my grandfather. My grandfather had died 40 years before, and he basically died as an unknown. And his name pops up on the screen, and there's this gigantic thread. And I was just like, well, what is this? And so I go through the thread, and it was from somebody from the country of Sweden trying to find out what happened to the immigrants who came over to America from that country. And they had all this family information that I never knew about. And so I ended up finding out that my ancestors came to Chicago in 1869. It was 2 years before the Chicago fire. And they actually were here during the fire. And the fire raged through downtown. They were pretty close to downtown. And they ended up going into Lake Michigan and waiting for the fire to kind of pass them by. And they helped rebuild the city. And I thought that was really interesting. And I found out that they were buried in a place called Graceland Cemetery. Has anyone heard of Graceland Cemetery?
Yeah.
What have you heard?
Well, they have a lot of Chicago, big Chicago families, and really cool headstones. It's like one of the well-known cemeteries in Chicago, so they do tours at Halloween to see all of the different headstones.
Right. Yeah, Graceland is filled with the founders of the city of Chicago. And I decided that I would go and see my ancestors' graves. And I walked into the cemetery, and the first thing I saw was that. And besides being, like a statue of death, it looks very much like DC Comics' Spectre character, who was like a ghost character that I really liked. So I was like, oh wow, it looks like a Spectre. But I thought that it was really, really odd and strange. And then that's another one. It's an interesting sculpture. This is the tomb of Potter Palmer. Potter Palmer was one of the founders of the city. He and his wife had donated a lot of things to the Art Institute that are still there. They were kind of like the leaders of the culture of the city. And that's a really interesting looking tomb. And then this is the gravesite of Marshall Field. And so it's you walk through there and you kind of see this whole history of Chicago going on before you. And when I found my ancestors' gravesite, there were no tombstones there. And so I thought, well, I really want to go and see if I can get tombstones from them. So I checked with Graceland Cemetery, and they said, well, what you have to do is you have to use these people, blah, 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 blah. And the people who they recommended were they had been in business since the 1800s. They were a family company, it's like passed down generation to generation. And I went in there, so they said, yes, we can help you out, no problem. And I became friends with the person who I talked to, this girl named Katie Gast. And I became Facebook friends with her. Now you're all on Facebook, right? Some of you are on Facebook. And you're going through your news feed and you're seeing what everybody's posting. And all of a sudden I have Katie Gast on my news feed. And it's one morbid thing after another, after another, after another. So there was this thing about people being buried naked and then sprouting up into trees, and this weird story and that weird story. And one of the weird stories that was on there was the 13 creepiest tombstones in the world. And I looked at it, I read it, it was very interesting. I went to bed. And the next day I woke up and the idea of Visitations #1 was in my head.
No.
And so I created a bunch of characters. That's them right there. I created a bunch of characters for the book based on the monuments in that particular news article or internet article. So the first one was kind of like this angel and death thing here. And I combined that with a friend of mine named Paige, and Paige is a model, and she did this steampunk thing. And so I made her like this horse skeletal girl. And that actually took the story and set it in a particular time because of the way she was dressed. There are two interesting things here. These monuments are both in Graceland Cemetery. This wasn't in that article, but I thought it was really cool. This is a very interesting monument that I'll come back to later on. But they're both characters in the book. This was the head of some saint that died in like 1350, and the head's been passed around to places, to place to place to place. And somebody owns it now. They're actually on Instagram. And again, I have the statue of death over there. This grave was really interesting because it just said, victim of the beast 666. And I wondered, well, what would that look like? So I have some friends on Twitter who are goth people. And so I put out this thing, and I'm like, hey, send me pictures of the scariest thing you've ever seen. And they sent me these frightening pictures. I'm like, okay, I'm not going to do that. But one of them was that one right there. And so I combined her with this project I was working on. I in addition to drawing, I also sculpt. And there's this thing called a crochet. And what an crochet is you take a skeleton, and most people sculpt the skeleton. I did, but you take a model skeleton, and then you build the muscles onto it. And you're able to kind of get a real good sense of how the human body works because of that. And this tomb, I think this is the one that really decided for me that I was going to do this story. It's of somebody breaking out. So I actually threw my brother-in-law in there, and he became one of the main characters in the story. But his character is based on that. And then, and so that was really interesting. And so I was able to draw the book. I wrote the book, I drew the book, I published the book, and I've been going to different comic book conventions throughout the city of Chicago. One of them is a convention known as C2E2. It takes place in the Corinth Place in March. Another one is Wizard World, which takes place in the Rosemont Convention Center. And I've been talking to people, and I start saying, well, ask about haunted Chicago. And people come up and they start telling me stories. And one girl was passing by my table, and I said to her, I said, hey, have you ever heard of Graceland Cemetery? And she said, yeah, my friends and I used to break in there all the time to get drunk. By the way, I don't recommend doing that ever. And I said, well, that's really interesting. Did you ever see anything when you were in there? And she said, nah. And I said, I'm sorry, did you see anything when you were in there? And she said, oh, we were drunk. And I said, what did you see? And she said, well, we saw this guy in a newsboy cap floating towards us. I'm like, okay, did your friend see this? And she said, yeah. I'm like, okay, that's really interesting. And then I said to her, had you ever heard of Rosehill Cemetery? Rosehill Cemetery, I actually was kitty corner from my house when I was growing up. It's kind of the sister cemetery to a certain degree to Graceland because they both have a lot of the city founders buried there. And there's different mayors and entertainers and things buried in Rosehill Cemetery. My family is always freaked out by Rosehill. My sister thought that it was haunted. So I asked her, have you ever heard of Rosehill Cemetery? And she said, yeah, we used to break in there all the time too. And when she said that, I was thinking, I was driving past it with a friend of mine not long before that. And he said, my sister and I were in there, we were visiting a relative, and we saw this woman in this old Victorian dress. She had one of those old-time baby carriages, is what he said. And I said, well, that's okay. I said, I've never heard of anything like that. And he goes, well, we didn't know who she was. He walked over to her and she disappeared. And he's like, it's a ghost. I know it was a ghost. I'm like, yeah, okay, whatever. And so when this girl was standing in front of my table and I'm talking to her, I said, did you see the woman in the Victorian dress with the baby carriage? And she said, yes, we did. I'm like, okay, well, that's 2 people who've seen this. That's really interesting. So I was also telling the story, and one of the ghosts that people in Chicago know is known as Resurrection Mary. And so somehow I started talking about that. And this girl walks up and she goes, my mom saw Resurrection Mary. I said, oh, really? And so everyone's got a story. So I started really investigating a lot of this stuff. And so I started doing this Haunted Chicago stuff. And it's funny because I just went to the Chicago Ghost Conference. And I had my book there, and I was showing people I'm selling it. And I had to tell them, oh, it's fiction. The ghost stories in here aren't real, not like the ones you guys have. And the people at the Ghost Conference actually are ghost hunters. They're real ghost hunters who live in the city of Chicago. Some of them have written books. They go into haunted places with sound detectors, and they actually listen and record what's there, and then they come back and they play it back. And so they have to like listen over and over and over, and then they get like you could hear sounds in there. It's really interesting. So so I wanted to talk a little bit about Chicago. Chicago's got a lot of history. And there are 2 different things I wanted to talk about. One of them was cemeteries, and the other one are actual places in Chicago. So I want to go back to Graceland Cemetery real quick. And the statue here is known as Eternal Silence. And it used to be all black. It was kind of worn away by the elements, which means it was probably a lot creepier looking before than it looks now, but it's still pretty eerie looking. And when I was there, it was around this time of the year. It was Halloween time. And there were a lot of leaves on the ground. It was a very, very, very strange, kind of an eerie kind of a look. My wife and I walked over to the statue, and there are coins by the feet. And does anyone know the legend of the river Styx and the ferryman? So one of the legends for the afterlife is when you die, and then you end up on this riverbank, and there's this creature called the ferryman who kind of looks like that, I guess. And he's got a raft, and you get on the raft, and you have to pay him in order to take you over to the afterlife. And I can only imagine that that's what these folks are doing here with the money. The other thing with the statue is the legend is if you ever stare into its face, you see a vision of your own death. I was far too scared to do it myself, so I don't know if it's true or not. But that's the legend that's attached to it. So the little girl statue. This is the grave of someone named Inez Clark, and she's a 7-year-old little girl. She died really early. Her parents were bereaved, and they decided that they were going to have the statue for her. And the statue was under a case because it was kind of getting worn down by the elements. And what happens during thunderstorms is the statue disappears. Or it disappears and you can hear sobbing through the cemetery. And this is Graceland Cemetery. It's a pretty famous place. But then the other thing about that is people have seen her frolicking through the graveyard at different times. Now it's all interesting to talk about legends and stuff like that. But with Inez Clark, someone at the Chicago Ghost Conference told me that they knew a security guard at Graceland Cemetery, and the security guard was the one who found the empty case. The other interesting thing about her is she's not actually buried there. I don't know who it is who's buried there, but the name in the records does not match up with the name on the monument. So it's a really, really odd story. And then Ludwig Wolff here, he was just some architect. I don't know, I don't really think he was all that famous. But his gravesite is because people have walked past it and heard a barking dog and howling coming from it. And on other occasions, they've actually seen a dog in front of from the site here. And the thing that's interesting about that is the dog has glowing green eyes. There's nothing special about this, with the exception that it's kind of buried into the earth here. But that's the story. And so leaving Graceland Cemetery and going over to Rosehill, this is a mausoleum in Rosehill Cemetery, and there's a bunch of famous people kind of stuck in there. They're not buried. They're just kind of because mausoleums are a little different than grave sites. One of the people who is buried or is Richard Warren Sears, and he was the head of the Sears department store. Has anyone heard of the Sears department store? Okay. The reason I asked that question is it's kind of a dying thing. I think there are only 2 of them left in the city of Chicago. And people have seen Richard Warren Sears walking through here, and he is wearing a top hat and tails. And I guess he doesn't bother anyone, he just kind of hangs out there. And then this is the site of a man named Charles Hopkinson. And he was somebody who had a lot of problems getting this mausoleum built. And when it was built and he died, people walked past there on the anniversary of his death and heard wailing, crying, and the sound of chains. It's very Christmas Carol-like. And then this is Frances Pierce. Frances Pierce was somebody who had died at a fairly early age, and then her infant daughter died a couple months afterwards. And on the anniversary of her death, I don't think she disappears from the case, but the case that's there for the elements, it fills up with white smoke. People have seen it. And I guess she's like coming back to find her husband, who's long dead at this point himself. So I want to go further south to Willowbrook Ballroom. Willowbrook Ballroom is the site of a very famous event. There was somebody who had a dance with a girl here, and the girl was very cold to the touch, and the person wanted to drive her home, and so they got in the car, and this is around 1935, 1940. They got into the car, and they were driving down Archer Avenue, and he kept saying, "What's your address? Where do you live? What's your address?" He got a name out of her, but what's your address? She just said, "Take me home, take me down Archer Avenue, take me home." And they drive past Resurrection Cemetery, and she disappeared. And he found out the next day that he went to the address where he thought she was, and it was the address of a girl who had died several years before. So this ghost, the hitchhiking ghost, is known as Resurrection Mary. And the story I just told you is by far not the only story about her. No one knows who she was for sure. There's the theory that it's this person right here, Anna Norcus, who died in an auto crash. Or this person here, her name was Mary Beverly, and she died in an auto crash as well. And so people have picked up Resurrection Mary on Archer Avenue over and over and over and over through the years. And she always disappears when they hit Resurrection Cemetery. And people have seen her in Resurrection Cemetery looking out through the bars of the cemetery. This is what the bars look like. And the interesting thing about this is these bars didn't come like this. And because of everybody walking by and people gawking at them, they remove these bars all the time, and they keep ending up like this. Archer Avenue itself, where the Willowbrook Ballroom is and where Resurrection Cemetery is a famous haunted place. There are numerous stories of a phantom hearse with horses that charges into Resurrection Cemetery from Archer Avenue, carrying the coffin of a small boy child. There are ghost lights. Has anyone ever heard of ghost lights? Ghost lights, apparently, I never heard of it until a couple weeks ago. There are these orbs, these glowing orbs of light that are around paranormal places. And they're not seen very often, but they are seen. They're the closest thing to a ghost that people have seen. So there's a lot of ghost lights hanging out on Archer Avenue at various times. And then the most famous haunted place in Illinois is a place called Bachelor's Grove Cemetery. And Bachelor's Grove is it's just a hotbed of paranormal activity. Apparently there's a bog in there. I've never been there personally. There's a bog in there. There's been a two-headed ghost seen there. There is a woman with an infant who has been seen walking through the grounds wailing and crying at the moon. There is a ghost of a farmer and his horse that went into the bog. And this thing, it's just an old farmhouse. But apparently that house appears and disappears all the time. Nobody can actually find it. They've seen it. They've walked towards it. When you walk towards this phantom farmhouse, it shrinks or it disappears. And this, when the photographer took this picture, there was nobody sitting there. This picture ran in the Chicago Sun-Times, so it's not like it was like some weird internet thing or the National Enquirer. It's Chicago Sun-Times, Chicago paper, and that is just an apparition that somebody caught on camera. So I want to leave the cemeteries and move to actual Chicago sites. This is a garage in Lakeview. Does anyone know where Lakeview is? Has everyone ever heard of Wrigley Field? Yeah. Okay, it's down the street from Wrigley Field. It's not that close, but it's a little further south of Wrigley Field, over on Clark Street. And in 1929, on Valentine's Day, Al Capone. Has anyone ever heard of Al Capone? Has anyone ever heard of Bugs Moran? For those of you who don't know, Al Capone was the leader of the Chicago gangsters on the South Side, and Bugs Moran was the leader of the North Side gangsters. It was like the North Side Irish. And they had been warring for years, and there's a whole great big story behind that. But Capone finally decided he had enough of Moran. He got information that Moran was going to be in this garage on Valentine's Day. And so he sent people, his gangsters, in dressed as police officers. So people saw police officers from the street walk into the garage, and then they heard machine gun fire. And then they marched people out. And what it was the gangsters were dressed up as police officers, and they killed Bugs Moran's gang. Bugs Moran actually wasn't there, he escaped. And the building stood for a really long time afterwards. Apparently one of the victims of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre is what it was called. One of the victims of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre supposedly haunted Al Capone until the day Al Capone died. The garage itself turned into a furniture store. There's a whole bunch of different things. And the city of Chicago, when the city of Chicago doesn't like something historically and it's embarrassing, they usually tear it down. So there's a whole bunch of buildings in Chinatown that are torn down for various reasons, and then this thing was torn down as well. And the people walking past this site will still hear the sound of machine gun fire and people screaming. The other thing about this is the building itself was demolished, and the wall that the people were lined up against, the bricks were kind of distributed all over the place. There was one guy who actually rebuilt the wall in a bathroom at some nightclub, and then he got rid of the bricks. The bricks are sold off, and the people who own the bricks have met with early deaths or really bad things happening after they acquire them, until they get rid of them. Has anyone heard of the Drake Hotel? What have you heard about the Drake?
That's like one floor that's
Do you know which floor? There's supposedly 2 floors in the Drake Hotel that are haunted. The 8th floor is haunted by the woman in red, and she was somebody who had killed herself on the day that the Drake opened. She had seen a lover of hers with some other woman, and she threw herself out the window. And then the woman in black was actually, the legend is that she actually killed somebody there, and she still haunts the hotel. And it's right in downtown Chicago. And that's a drawing of it. Now, the thing is, and does anyone know what this is? Yeah. Water Tower is real close to the Drake Hotel. And the thing that nobody knows, that everyone's forgotten, is where the Water Tower is and where the Drake is and where Lake Michigan is. That was all a cemetery. And it was a cemetery that was gotten rid of before the fire. This is one of the only buildings standing after the fire. And the legend is that the person who was attending it, when he saw the fire coming, he went upstairs and hung himself because he thought he was going to die anyway. And obviously the fire did not touch the building. And so people have seen a body hanging from the tower of Water Tower. They can see it from the windows. There are police officers who have run in there to find out what's going on. There's nothing in there. And then the Erequest Theatre. Has anyone ever heard of this? The Erequest Theatre was the site of another fire. And it was 602 people were killed. The fire broke out during a performance. It was supposed to be a completely fireproof building. You know, kind of like the Titanic was completely sink-proof, and the first thing it did was it sunk. And so so there are a lot of people who were killed here. And it was rebuilt as the Oriental Theater, the Ford Theater, and that's it right now. It's a pretty famous theater in Chicago. There are a lot of plays that are there, and people can hear screams in there, and the screams take place like when no one's around and things like that. But the alley behind it is where a bunch of dead bodies were laid right after the fire, and so they were put back here, and then there weren't, because they didn't think that it was fireproof, or they thought it was fireproof. There weren't any fire escapes like there are now, so people jumped out the window in the hopes of jumping onto a fire escape and fell to their deaths. So the alley back there is the hotbed of paranormal activity too, and there's a lot of things that people have seen in and out of that alley. And so that's kind of my little history of Chicago haunting things. Now the book I'm working on, how are we on time?
We got about 8 minutes.
Oh, okay, great. The book I'm working on is actually the history of Chicago as seen through the eyes of the residents of the city's oldest cemetery. And I want to show you a trailer for it. When I originally came up with the idea for this, I was planning to not have any real Chicago ghost stories, but as I find out some of these stories, I can't not put them in there. So I don't know exactly what stories will go in or when, but some of the real history of the city will be included in the book, but the real history of Chicago hauntings will be as well. Are there any questions? Yeah.
What's the title of the book that you're writing again?
Visitations. Yeah.
Are there any haunted cemeteries around here?
You know what? That was a question I was going to ask you guys, to be honest. I'm sure there are. I think there's haunted stories for every cemetery that's out there. Does anyone know any stories, haunted cemetery stories around here? We'll see if it's something that's worth investigating for sure. Because there's a lot. I passed about 4 or 5 cemeteries.
On the way here.
And I guarantee that there is stuff that's going on there.
How did you do your research for this? Was it just kind of talking to other people, or were you
For which part?
for the haunted monuments and the
You know what? Some of it was. It kind of started out where I was looking at it, like with the Eternal Silence. When I was looking at it, I was like, well, that's kind of interesting, and then I think I read a little bit about it, and it was right there, and so it kind of unfolded from that. And that the little girl statue, the Inez Clark thing, is. I mean, I just think it's super creepy, and how could it not be haunted? You know. But the stories have kind of just come to me, you know, here and there. Now, when I was at the Chicago Ghost Convention a couple of weeks ago, I actually thought I was going to get a lot more information than I did. I got information, just not the kind I thought I was going to get. So, you know, I heard all about ghost hunting, which I had never known before, but I didn't really get a lot of the history. Oh, and actually, I do have one more story. So So Archer Avenue, which where Resurrection Cemetery is and Resurrection Mary is, has another ghost story, and it's not quite a ghost story. And I actually read about this when I was doing prep for this, and I contacted a lady named Ursula Białowski, and she's a paranormal investigator. She's in Chicago, and she writes a number of books. You can look her up. So apparently there was this dance at a place called Kaiser Hall, and it was over on the south over by where all these other places are. And there was a woman there, and it was probably around the turn of the century, and she was dancing with this really handsome stranger. And as they were dancing, she looked down, and then she screamed, and then everybody started gathering around them, and this person who she was dancing with backed up against the window and jumped out the window. And so when that happened, people ran down the stairs and went and followed him, and they found hoof prints where he had landed. And so the story is that the devil came to dance in the pale moonlight on Archer Avenue, which I thought was really interesting. And so I contacted Ursula, and I said, well, was that the Willowbrook Ballroom? Did they just change the name? And she said no. And then she said, well, that's tied into the story at Hull House. Does anyone know what Jane Addams' Hull House was? Did someone say yep?
Yeah, they had here. I did a paper when I was in school on it, but I think that she had started it, and it was for there were girls who were there. It wasn't an orphanage, but it was somehow
She was helping people. Yeah.
She was helping people work with
Right. Right. Yeah. Jane Addams ran this place called Hull House, and she was helping. It was kind of like a home of wayward women. At the time, there were a lot of women who were forced into crime and prostitution and stuff, and so she would bring them in and try and get them started on a new life. And it was famous mostly because at the time, women weren't really doing anything. It was a man's world. Women weren't starting up anything. They were kind of off in the background. But there is a story about a devil baby at Hull House. And did you come across this at all?
I was in grade school, so no.
Okay.
My mom probably showed that book.
I don't know much about it. I read something about it a few months ago, and I thought, oh, hey, that might be great for the second series of Visitations. Visitations is a number of different series. First series is the turn of the century. Second series is going to be the 1920s, and it's going to go on from there for as long as I live. And we'll see how far I get. But what Ursula was telling me was that the story that I just told you about the devil coming to dance on Archer Avenue was tied in, and that was his child that was born at Hull House.
That's creepy.
Yeah, it is creepy.
Does anybody have any other questions for Mr. Larson? Well, let's thank him very much for coming. Thank you.
Thanks.
If you have orange sheets, I will take them over here to stamp them. If you have raffle tickets, you can hold them or drop them in the box over here.
actually had questions and stuff that